Welcome everyone to our talk. Um, my name is George Obaido, and together with me, I've got Abebe.
Hey.
We'll be presenting on narratives and counter-narratives on data sharing in Africa. Now, we know data sharing is good. If we know the benefits that it offers to society, we know that there's a global hype about data sharing, but our work looks much more beyond this hype. What data sharing is somewhat very complex, especially looking at it from the perspective of an African perspective. We are looking at how its goodness and benefits are tied to who, how, where, and so on, who benefits from data sharing equivalently. Now, we've been able to highlight two key stakeholders from the data sharing ecology. We've got the data subject and the data collectors. In here, the stakeholders are the ones who who are responsible for providing data, which is similarly used extensively by other stakeholders in this ecology. Now, looking at it from looking at the African data sharing ecology, you see that those at the top of the iceberg are the ones who have significant power, and they leverage on the data sharing, as well as they create several policies, and those beneath or those below the iceberg are the ones that are indirectly affected by policies made by the stakeholders. Now, we've been able to look at the following questions, and these questions are similarly tied essentially to our work. And we tend to answer several of these questions by looking at perspectives and experiences of African communities and initiatives that affect the data sharing ecology. For example, it's from data sharing, is exploited, what data is shared, up to who is telling the story itself. Now, there's this very famous or very nice quote from Jita. Basically, it's all about when we ask that someone represents the African perspective, we find out that an African is not even involved in the first place, and our work tends to drive that. So I'm going to hand over to Abebe to run us through the storytelling approach, which is the methodology we use for this meeting.
Thanks, George. So as George said, our aim is to flip the data sharing narrative and ask data sharing from the benefits or challenge of data sharing from the perspective of the data subjects, the data collector, and local African communities and African researchers. So in order to do that, we use the methodology of storytelling for various reasons, including oral story has a long and intimate relationship with the African continent, from philosophy to poetry, oral history, oral narration has been part and parcel of the continent. But also storytelling has been used by various indigenous communities as a way of reclaiming voices and as a way of narrating their own stories, as opposed to their stories being narrated by others. So in order to So we created personas by interviewing 10 data practitioners that are either located in the African continent or are scattered all over the globe, but have African roots, in order to kind of understand and get their narrative of the challenges that they face as they try to carry out their data practices. After we conducted the interviews, we anonymized and pseudonymized all names, all names of places, all names of companies, anything that's identifiable. And we kind of transcribed the interviews, and we organized them based on themes and the based on emerging recurring themes that the data practitioners identified as the central challenge that pose their data sharing practices. We provide a brief example here, where in this example, where we see a Western-based, a Europe-based NGO goes into a local place that we've named Buranda in order to provide service in the process where they have to keep record of various data, and we get into the details of the data sharing challenges and the various problems that arise. We provide various personas in the paper. You can take a look there. So there are many challenges that get in the way of equitable data sharing from the perspective of locals, again, from the perspective of the data subject, the data collectors, and African researchers. We've identified about 6 here, but in the paper we only get in detail in the bullet points that are highlighted in blue here, which are power asymmetries, trust, and lack of awareness of context and local knowledge. So power asymmetries as the main challenge is something that is very nuanced and something that manifests in a very very nuanced way. This might range from Western NGOs, which often dictate that data needs to be shared, from those bodies setting the agenda for the type of data that needs to be collected, the kind of research that needs to be carried out in the interpretation of the results, all throughout all the pipeline, all the way. We find these very nuanced power asymmetries that pose very almost invisible challenges, but nonetheless those are challenges. In a kind of clear example, this research provides, where we find that in the Zambian Hills research, for example, up to 90% of the funding comes from external funders, and that brings much more bargaining power to the funders in how they set the agenda when it comes to opening up data or data sharing. This in turn leaves Zambian scholars or the data subjects themselves very little room to negotiate, to have any say about how data is shared or with whom. But also we find, because of the colonial history and the past of the continent, we find that inequalities and structural obstacles are built in the whole data ecosystem. Here is an example where in the process of working on this project, we went looking for this article titled Open Data Sharing in the Global South, Who Benefits? And clearly this article is about the Global South, about data practices, but ironically, accessing such article requires about $30 US. So these are the kind of really nuanced asymmetries that put global north researchers at a much better bargaining power compared to global south researchers. So the question then becomes, it really is not about opening up data or sharing it with other parties, but it's also about making sure that there are proper infrastructures for global south researchers to also access such data. The other issue, the other challenge that was recurring that we identified is the issue of trust. The issue of trust was preventing various scholars from sharing their data with other researchers. So a researcher might provide their data to like another researcher because they know them personally, because they can be guaranteed that that data will not be used by someone else. But it becomes much more difficult. It becomes difficult to guarantee that the trust will be shared. The trust will carry over when that data is shared with someone else. So again, NGOs are mainly the ones driving the data sharing in open data initiatives, and for much of our interviewees, we find that for local communities, they tend to a lot of these initiatives which come from outside tend to be met with suspicion because of lack of trust, and this really impedes the data collection and the data sharing process. We also provide an example from one of the personas from the paper where trust becomes a really clear issue that is in the way of data sharing. Another issue that a lot of that the interviewees raised and that is persistent in the literature is most African researchers are generally supportive of data sharing, but when it comes to opening up data, there is the worry that open data with open data sneaks in parachute research, where global north researchers use that data, use African data to publish academic papers in prestigious journals, often without much credit to the African scholars that are collecting data, but also global north researchers by publishing academic work using such data, in a way taking charge of the narrative of African stories. So narrating African stories, so global north researchers narrating African stories, which means, so maybe and colleagues did a systematic lit review that unfortunately confirmed that parachute research is not just unwarranted worry, but there is something to it. There is a reason why many African researchers are not so enthusiastic about opening up data, and what they examined. Abebe and et al. Examined African authorship proportions in the biomedical literature that was published between 1980 and 2016, where the data is from Africa. And what they found is that African researchers are very underrepresented in the global health community, even when the data originates from Africa. And if for much of health publication, health issues, especially concerning diseases such as Ebola, parachute research is a common occurrence. The third challenge that we have identified is lack of awareness of local people's way of life, lack of context. And this is a challenge that not only gets in the way of data sharing between the global south and global north, but it's also a challenge that is recurring even within the continent, because the continent is huge, with over 54 countries, with thousands of languages being spoken. So even African researchers themselves find it difficult to access data and to share data as they move around, because they lack the understanding of the culture, the knowledge, and the context. We also illustrate these through the personas. So, conclusion, the paper is very rich. It encompasses so many points, but the central points is that we want to emphasize that it's not good enough to just ask, is data sharing beneficial? Is opening up data good? But we also have to accompany such questions with for whom. We also have always to include stakeholders that are often left out, that are at the bottom of the iceberg, as George illustrated earlier. We also, there is so much cliched stories, so much deficit narratives, where the narratives focus on, poverty or hunger or disease or something like that. We also try to push against that negative stereotype in the paper, by illustrating that the continent is full of data sharing initiatives. But the point is to make those data sharing initiatives and open data initiatives more equitable. It's not data sharing initiatives that we lack. It's making them equitable that is more of a challenge. We also aspire to this nothing about us without us slogan, where we aspire that African stories are told by Africans. We tried to uplift African scholars, African work, by referring to African scholars and by citing predominantly African scholars throughout the paper. And so the final point we want to make is that data sharing has to be a practice that, first and foremost, that primarily benefits local communities, and it has to be a practice that centers local experts and local voices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to you reading our paper and also getting feedback, from reading our paper. Thank you so much, and do have a lovely day.